Thank you. Apparently too busy to show up on time, eh? I apologize for that. Thank you for the kind introduction, and my heartiest congratulations to Alan and the Ontario Chamber for the initiative of this economic summit. I am sorry to be late. I was stuck on my favorite parking lot, otherwise known as the Gardiner Expressway. There's nothing express about it. And unfortunately, my friend Peter McKay's helicopter was not available, so I had to take my time getting here. And I understand you had my other colleague, Jim Flaherty, here yesterday, my fellow Irishman in cabinet. We both wear the green tie. Reminds me that exactly a year ago, I was in Ireland on a recruitment trip, the first time a Canadian immigration minister had gone abroad deliberately to recruit people for our labor market. And I went on their biggest, Lynch is an Irish name too, isn't it, Kevin? I went on our biggest, Ireland's biggest television program. It's called The Late Late Show. And it's kind of like the David Letterman show, but a little more serious, a little less frivolous. Thankfully, they weren't talking about the mayor of Toronto. But they said to me, how is it that Canada, they said, we noticed that you went through the recession barely scathed. It seemed to go pretty well in Canada. And they were wondering, how did this happen? And I said, well, very simply, I said, we had an Irishman, a Flaherty, who was the finance minister, Carney was the central bank governor, and a Lynch was the head of the civil service. And they said, well, our finance minister, our bank governor, and the head of our civil service were all Irish, and they got it completely buggered up. But I guess we have some other things going for us in Canada, and that's what I want to talk to you about. As I'm sure Jim highlighted, for all of the challenges we face, we have some good problems here in Canada. The best economic record in the G7, one of the best in the OECD, the best educated workforce in the developed world, one of the strongest fiscal positions in the developed world. We will have a balanced federal budget in 2050, lowest federal debt and deficit ratios amongst the major developed economies, expanding export and trade markets. That's a big strategic point. With CETA, our new virtually tariff-free access to the 27 developed member states of the European Union, representing 500 million consumers, and with our preferential access to the U.S., we're the only country in the world that will soon have special preferential trade arrangements with developed markets representing 800 million people. The huge extractive resource industries that are coming on stream with some $650 billion of projected capital investments. We have got a lot going for us, and Ontario has got a lot going for it. This must and will continue to be the engine of Canada's economy. So if we have a big challenge, the challenge I hear constantly from employers and business groups is that of the skills shortage. Now, this is a complex and nuanced issue because I'm reminded every day that the aggregate labor market information, that data that is extracted from the StatsCan surveys and that is analyzed by economists, indicates that we aren't, according to that data, we're not really facing a skill or labor shortage in our economy. And that view would seem to be supported by wage levels, which have in the post-recession period barely kept track with inflation. Not exactly indicative of a super tight labor market or normally you would expect, quite rightly, as the labor economists point out, you would expect to see higher levels of wage inflation in the context of general labor or skills shortages. So that's one side of the story. But then there's a whole other side of the story that I hear from when I meet with employers across Ontario and right around the country. Whether I'm in the Kitchener-Waterloo IT corridor or talking to agricultural operators in Eastern Ontario, big construction companies dealing with mines in the Ring of Fire, or Tenaris building pipe up in Sudbury. Doesn't matter where I am, over and over again. Employers, business groups, sector councils, industry associations tell me that either one of the top, if not the top challenge that they are facing today is that of a skills shortage, and they project this only to get much worse. The construction sector says, this is nationally, that they'll need 319,000 new workers before the end of this decade. The mining industry says they'll need 145,000 more by 2020. The petroleum sector estimates 130,000 workers needed by the end of the decade, who are not currently in the pipeline, so to speak. The supply chain sector expect a shortage of 357,000 workers between now and 2020. The Association of Canadian Community Colleges says that who held an excellent skills summit in Ottawa 2 weeks ago, by the way, says that in less than a decade, employers will not find qualified candidates for 1.5 million available jobs. Skills Canada, excellent organization, tells us that we're going to need 1 million skilled trade workers alone by 2020. The Conference Board of Canada, with whom I just met in Toronto at their education summit, says Ontario alone is losing out on $24.3 billion in economic activity because employers can't find people with the skills they need. And I think they also estimated that the province is losing about $3.7 billion in annual revenue as a result. And your national body, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, listed skills shortages as one of Canada's top 10 barriers to competitiveness. It's a survey in a survey that showed that a third of the owners of small and medium-sized businesses identified skills shortages as a significant constraint on their growth. So how do you describe this or explain this paradox? The paradox of too many jobs without people and too many people without jobs. And how do you explain this weird, I call it parallel monologue that we're having on these issues? It's not really a dialogue. You've got, let's be blunt about it, you've got most labor unions, many academic economists, some in the media and some political figures saying that based on the high-level aggregate labor market information, all of which, by the way, is essentially retrospective, that there is no labor or skills shortage in Canada. And then yet, you have the lived reality of employers, small, medium, and large, in sectors right across the spectrum and all across the province and the country saying something different. Well, clearly, what this points to is a failure in our labor market information system. And I'm here essentially to plead guilty, to admit that we must do a radically better job of getting robust, nuanced, and sector and specific labor market information that can give us all a much better picture of the realities that we are facing. Because what the employers tell me from coast to coast, whether, and by the way, it's not just, here's the peculiar thing, it's not just what we call the skills mismatch. There are actually, and quite paradoxically, quite perversely, there are areas of our economy with a lack of available low-skilled or unskilled workers. I was just out in Fredericton. Sorry, I know your summit is on Ontario issues, but I think you have to look at the national perspective. Meeting with fish processing plant operators, pleading with me to accelerate access to temporary foreign workers, because apparently they need people to leave their village in Thailand to drive 10 hours to Bangkok and fly 24 hours to Toronto and fly out to Moncton and drive out to a rural Canadian Atlantic village where there is 14% unemployment and people collecting employment insurance, but who are unwilling to work for $16 an hour processing fish off-season. There is something fundamentally wrong. They're right down the street, right around us, right within a kilometer of where we are. There are farm operations that have to bring people in from the Caribbean and Mexico, even though in order to work in agricultural jobs, even though we're in a province with 8.3% unemployment and, 16% youth unemployment. So actually, yes, the skills mismatch, skills shortage debate is a really interesting one, but there are also some broader structural issues at play here that we should not lose sight of. And so, this is difficult for us as policymakers to explain to Canadians, because intuitively they say, well, my kid or my niece or nephew, they're out of a job. It's 21% youth unemployment in the GTA. Why are you bringing in any of these temporary foreign workers at all, for example? Or why do we have any immigrants coming to Canada? And what is this you're talking about, a skills mismatch? So there is a general public skepticism about what's going on, And we all need to do a better job of getting relevant, robust, detailed, sector and region-specific labor market information. This is one of the many issues that I intend to raise tomorrow in my meeting with my provincial and territorial colleagues in what is ridiculously the first meeting of the Forum of Labor Market Ministers in 4 years. But much more must be done, and I'm going to address a number of different policy areas at a high level with you. First of all, education. Let's talk about primary and secondary education. You will have seen the very troubling data that came out of the OECD study on the STEM disciplines and with a focus on numeracy. Very robust research. I think the Canadian portion of that study was based on over 17,000 respondents, which indicated that Canada is falling behind in terms of educational outcomes on basic numeracy and the STEM disciplines. Given what we all know about the future economy, this should be deeply troubling, deeply worrisome to us. But what about the whole old tradition of technical and vocational training in our high schools? Whatever happened to that? 40 years ago, there was widespread availability of technical and vocational training, shop schools, and classes for young people. But we had interest groups. I'm sorry, I'm just very direct, I'm going to say it. Teachers' unions lobbied to say that anyone who's going to teach in a high school had to have a certification having gone through teachers' college. Well, how many guys who used to teach shop have a year or two to go and to get their certification at teachers' college? None is the answer, which is why there are virtually no kids enrolled in full-time vocational high schools. You know that York University, about a decade ago, did a study that found that the number of individual technology courses taken by secondary school students in Ontario schools dropped from nearly 500,000 in 1973 to 250,000 in 1996. I haven't seen more recent data. If anyone here has it, I'd like to see it, but I expect the slope has continued downward. To give you another reference point, vocational diplomas granted in Quebec declined from 17,000 in 1976 to 5,000 in 1992. And another study I've seen indicates that only 1% of high school kids are enrolled in vocational programs. Not only did we did we create these ridiculous barriers to the tradition of technical training in high schools, but we began culturally to devalue that kind of practical work. And I don't think we have been sharing adequate information with young people about what the signals that are being sent by the labor market. What we intend to, we in fact announced in our budget this year that we will be launching a program to provide relevant information on incomes and other possibilities in the full spectrum of occupations in a way that is, by the way, user-friendly and through social media. So we want kids if they're not hearing this from their high school counselors, we want them to be able to go online to an app and find out that they can make 3 times more in Ontario as a certified welder than as someone with a BA in political science. We have a surplus of those in Ottawa, by the way. And the importance of STEM industries in general, STEM disciplines in general. You know that in the last decade, university enrollment in Canada has skyrocketed from 850,000 in 2001 to 1.2 million students enrolled last year, an increase of nearly 400,000 students. However, in the science, technology, engineering, and math fields, enrollment increased by only 50,000 students. In the last decade, and this is a particular challenge with young women, in the last decade we've seen 220,000 women enrolling in university, an increase, but of that, only 15,000 are enrolling in these high-demand STEM disciplines, only less than 10% of the increment of young women in our universities. Now, these fields used to make up, the STEM fields used to make up 24% of university enrollment in Canada. That has now dropped to 20%. I think these numbers are all essentially the same for Ontario. At the very same time that students are turning away from the science, technology, engineering, and math fields, employment in these areas is growing at 2.5%, which is double the growth rate of overall Canadian employment. The Canadian Occupational Projection System states that there will be over 1.1 million job openings in the science, technology, engineering, and math fields in the coming decade. This speaks to the heart of the reforms we need to make. Students are turning away from the very fields in which they are likely to get the best job prospects in the future. And this is particularly critical now that women make up 60% of those enrolled in post-secondary university education. Now, look, I want to be clear, put this on the record. I'm an advocate of the humanities. I studied philosophy. I believe that kids should have an opportunity to go into the liberal arts. But they should also know what the opportunity cost of that is. They should make informed choices. And in every way, in our high schools, in our universities, our political leadership, our economic leaders, we need to send positive reinforcing messages about the dignity of all forms of work, not just those that flow from professional, post-secondary, academic style education. And moreover, I think as Canadians, as Ontarians, we need to take a step back in humility to recognize that perhaps there are other jurisdictions around the world who have figured this out much better than we have. Take, for example, Germany, whose famous Mittelstadt dual training system has led to the most robust labor market in the developed world, certainly in the European Union. In Germany, half as many young people enroll in academic university programs as is the case in Canada, and yet their youth unemployment rate is 5% versus 13% youth unemployment in Canada. Half as many in university, almost 3 times more likely, or actually the unemployment rate, 1/3 virtually of what it is for young people in Germany versus Canada. And so tomorrow, and by the way, you know why that is. Because right from the junior high school level on, young people are approached in a collaborative way by unions, employers, their educators, supported by the state and federal governments, encouraging them to get practical on-the-job skill training, where in many cases, even in high school, they're spending 2 days on a shop floor while continuing their academic studies. But everything from co-op programs that pay them, to the messages that are sent by their teachers, to the welcoming attitude of the labor unions, all of this is designed to reinforce positive vocational decisions by young people. And this is why I want to encourage my provincial colleagues tomorrow to join with me on a mission to Germany and perhaps a couple of the other European countries to study closely their dual training systems, to see what is applicable here in Canada. Bill Clinton always used to remind us that one definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different outcome. Well, it's about time that, quite frankly, those responsible for our education systems, I'm going out on a bit of a limb here in terms of federal jurisdiction, but those in charge of education systems have to begin to rethinking some of these questions quite fundamentally, in my view. Just as we need to rethink our apprenticeship system. This is an area where the provinces hold almost all of the levers and where we need to do much better. Across Canada, we have 13 different apprenticeship systems with enormous inconsistencies. For instance, the training and certification requirements vary in relation to on-the-job hours, technical curricula, and program duration. There are also disparities with respect to in-school training and assessments. These inconsistencies mean that apprentices who wish to move to another province or continue or complete their training are often unable to do so because the systems can be so different. Yet another barrier to labor mobility within Canada. At the same time, employers wishing to recruit new apprentices from out of province face similar challenges. Many have told me that one of the most difficult regulations for them is having to employ a specific number of certified journeymen to be eligible to register an apprentice. Known, of course, as the apprenticeship journeyman ratios, they vary between provinces and among different trades, quite significantly. Apprenticeship journeyman ratios are much higher in Ontario and Quebec and lower in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Now, does that mean that the workplaces in Alberta and Saskatchewan are less safe? I don't think so. I think this is a reflection, at least in measure, of a 1970s-style labor protectionism that does not reflect the demographic reality of today. Now, I know the Ontario College of Trades has reviewed the ratios for the 33 trades in this province, but frankly, I believe that more action needs to be taken by the college to fix Ontario's high ratios. And I believe there is a strong case for harmonization across Canada. How does it make any sense that a young Ontarian who's done the first couple of years on his apprenticeship program on the way to become a journeyman electrician hears about a great opportunity in Saskatchewan? He moves out there and finds that his hours are not portable, or he has to start out all over again. There are a lot of other things we can do to help. Our government has introduced a number of incentives, the apprenticeship incentive grant, hiring credit for employers of apprentices, the apprenticeship completion grant. If you combine all of these things together, it represents up to $4,000 in support for people who go into apprentices. The last missing piece in terms of policy, though, seems to be really facilitating the completion. We have I think over 400,000 Canadians enrolled in apprenticeship programs, but fewer than half that many go on to finish them. So there really is a bit of a gap that we need to work on. One of the things I'm looking at is to modify the rules of the Canada Student Loan Program so that we could actually help those kids get preferential financing when they take time off work to do their formal classroom training. Right now, typically they have to go on employment insurance. But I have an even better idea. How about the employers in this country step up to the plate in the way that they do in many European countries and actually pay their apprentices at their proper wage level through the formal training period? When I ask employers this, why is it that the private sector is at the bottom end of the OECD, the Canadian private sector is at the bottom end of the OECD with respect to investments in skills training and job training? The answer I typically get is people are concerned about poaching, particularly the SMEs. How does it make any sense for a small contractor to invest thousands of dollars in developing a new apprentice, and the moment he gets his ticket, he goes to the bigger dollars of a major employer? We have to find ways to get beyond this. We have to realize, like they do in Germany, that all employers are in this together, and that by growing the available pool of skilled and certified labor, we will all end up benefiting in the long run. Quickly, another point I want to touch on is ensuring that we do everything possible to help new Canadians realize their potential in our labor market. Now, you know the story here. For 40 years, we've seen declines in the economic results for immigrants. We used to, back in the early 70s, before the point system came in, when we actually allowed skilled tradesmen and women to come into Canada, the average immigrant was making 90% of the average income in Canada shortly after their arrival. That's now down to 60%. And of course, the rate of unemployment amongst recent immigrants is twice as high as in the overall population. And of course, behind these figures lies terrible stress and missed opportunities and tragedies for many families who have uprooted themselves from other parts of the world to come here ostensibly as professionals, only to face a cycle of survival jobs as their skills atrophy. We must do better for those folks. We need them because of the changing demography, because of the retirement of the boomers and our low birth rate, but it's not right to invite people to come here just to face underemployment. That's why our government has put so much emphasis on fundamental reform of the immigration system to move from what was a rigid, slow-moving, passive immigration system with deteriorating outcomes to a fast, flexible, demand-driven, labor market-linked immigration system that will increase significantly the percentage of immigrants who arrive here with a pre-arranged job, who have already been pre-assessed so that when they get off the plane, both they and their employer are confident that they'll be able to get their certification if they don't already have it. So that people can walk off that plane instead of with a sense of foreboding, with a spring in their step, knowing who their first employer will be with a pre-arranged job. Our data tells us that immigrants who arrive with pre-arranged jobs earn twice as much as those who don't. It's just common sense. I raise this because Ontario, of course, which has typically been the recipient of the largest number of immigrants to Canada, Ontario employers need to understand and seize the opportunity of our new fast and flexible immigration system. I won't get into this in great, please, okay. I won't go into this in great detail now, except because I simply don't have time. And you want to get me started immigration reform, I'll take several hours. But I want you to know that through the new system we're designing, which will be fully implemented by the end of next year, is a whole new world in terms of immigration selection for economic immigrants. And we need employers to be partners with us in making this work. The system is in large measure based on success stories in Australia and New Zealand, and we know it can work here in Ontario. Close with one last point that I'll be raising tomorrow with my provincial counterparts, and that is our proposal for a Canada Job Grant. Now, this has been contentious, and I'm expecting to hear lots of different views from my provincial colleagues tomorrow. But I just want to take a step back and explain what we're trying to do here. You know, employers have been telling us for years that they should be playing a larger role in the training decisions. It just makes sense. It's the employers who create the jobs. Training is ostensibly to prepare people for jobs. So why wouldn't we have employers participating in identifying who gets what kind of training with a job at the end of it? That's the logic. It's based on the following observation. We spend billions of dollars at the federal and provincial levels on skills development and job training, and yet we have relatively high unemployment and many unfilled jobs. And secondly, it's based on the observation that employers are not investing enough in training. So what the job grant conceptually hopes to do is to prime the pump, to leverage more private sector investment in training by inviting employers to identify specific individuals to receive specific training programs, at the end of which they're willing to guarantee that that person will receive a job, which at its simplest level is what the German system does, of course, starting from an earlier age. Now, the provinces are saying, well, look, we'd prefer you just send us this money and we'll use it to help do basic life skills, literacy, and so forth for people who are at the margins of the labor market. Look, I recognize there's a need for that. I would tend to call that more social programming than job training. And I think provinces have a responsibility to address those folks, just as we at the federal government do through billions of dollars that we invest in training for Aboriginal Canadians, disabled Canadians, young unemployed Canadians, older workers in need of retraining. So we're not talking about abandoning those groups that are underrepresented in the workforce. We are talking about taking one discrete portion of the public training investment and basically trying to get employers to identify people who will actually have guaranteed jobs at the end of it. We'll be very flexible with the provinces and how we try to develop this program, but I think it's consuming too much oxygen in the debate. Quite frankly, there are much bigger and more important issues, including apprenticeship reform, labor market mobility, and let me just say this. How ridiculous is it that you can move from, you can be a dentist and go from Portugal to Poland and practice the next day, or a welder who goes from Slovakia to Ireland, you can work and get your certification in principle the next day, but you can't go from Ontario to Quebec. We respect provincial jurisdiction, but we also must not lose sight of the vision of our Constitution, which sees Canada as an economic union. And so let me just say in closing that we must do a radically better job of implementing the spirit of the Agreement on Internal Trade, for interprovincial labor mobility, for mutual recognition of credentials, for streamlining and speeding up credential recognition for foreign-trained professionals, for reforming our education systems, both secondary and post-secondary. If we get these things right, and if employers put more skin in the game, and governments get beyond some of the interest group politics that have held up reform in these areas, I believe the sky is the limit. Look, we have, as I said at the beginning, a lot of great problems, but fundamentally, best educated population in the world, best fiscal situation of the major developed economies, a huge and growing expansion of our trade markets, the incredible blessing of our natural resources. So let's fix this one thing, and the sky will be the limit for Canada's economy in the future. Thanks very much. take questions. Too late
Sorry?
to take questions? I'm happy to.
No, if you wish to. Now, the minister is willing to take a couple of questions if folks want. This is, I think, a great chance because he's really challenged us to work with him on how we actually improve labor markets. It's in business interests, it's in the government's objective function. How do we do it? I think it's a chance, and he's certainly open to having kind of that dialogue. So are there questions?
And I'll be brief because I know the vineyard is next. You got important work to do there, eh?
There's a question over here. While the mic is coming, speak loudly.
Hi, Minister. Jason Field from Life Sciences Ontario. First, I'm really encouraged by your recognition of the fact that we need better data and better labor market data. That's one of the reasons why our organization supported BioTalent's labor market survey on biotechnology that was released in September. The interesting thing about that study and what it showed and what data shows is that STEM is not necessarily the silver bullet. Mm-hmm. I think we just have to be cautious about that. So we have, as you mentioned, a highly educated young workforce. But a lot of those science graduates are without jobs. And in part it's because we haven't implemented the policies in place to support startup companies, and Rafi Hofstein sitting right here in front of me cheering me on, to support the startup companies that will hire and create the jobs for these young people. So, you know, the solution from a STEM perspective and a life sciences perspective, in my mind, is better support for those companies. When you look at the BioTalent survey, the two conclusions that they come to in biotechnology and where the gaps are in soft skills within the sciences and employers that don't have the resources to hire students. And so they go out and they're looking for people with experience that they can drop into these positions. And that's why they're not training as well. So you've hit on a number of these key points, but I just want to caution that STEM and encouraging STEM graduates is not necessarily the silver bullet.
I agree. There is no one silver bullet in this hugely complex and nuanced area. Far be it from me to suggest that STEM is a silver bullet. I'm not sure I passed grade 7 algebra. But look, what my point is that clearly there is an emergence, and one of my points is the skilled trades, you know, require an increasing degree of sophistication in hard science that was not the case in the past. So it's not just about scientists in labs. If you want to become a certified welder, you have to have university level chemistry knowledge now. That wasn't the case 30 and 40 years. All of these areas are becoming more sophisticated. In all of the the electrical trades, high levels of sophistication that are required, which were not in the past. So whether it's the pure sciences, abstract research, or many of the skilled trades, clearly people need a strong basis in the STEM disciplines. And my point is simply this, that it is shrinking, these disciplines are shrinking as a fraction of the overall spectrum of post-secondary education. I think we could agree that's going in the wrong direction. All the other points you make there are valid and well taken. In terms of startups, I hope you recognize the federal government has been trying to support the development of critical mass in venture capital in Canada with the following from the Jenkins report, I think our $400 million fund to leverage more VenCap. And I did my part at immigration by creating the new startup visa, hopefully attracting to Canada brilliant young entrepreneurs, many of them Asians who are stuck in the United States with brilliant concepts but can't get their green cards. And we're now offering them permanent residency in Canada if they can get backing from a Canadian VenCap or angel firm. So to help develop that ecosystem as well.
Minister, Rory McAlpine, I'm with Maple Leaf Foods. I appreciate very much your characterization of some of those contradictions in our labor market and what we need to do to fix those. And I appreciate the emphasis that it's about not just skilled, but semi-skilled, low-skilled. We've got issues in all those categories, certainly in food manufacturing. But the one area you highlight this great initiative on the Expression of Interest program for identifying potential new immigrants and matching them to the employers that need their skills. My question would be, can't we do better with our own pool of unemployed or others in the country. You have, as the federal government, a full database of everybody receiving employment insurance in the country. You have all the information on every foreign student that's on a foreign student visa here, who after their term of study probably wants to stay in the country, but has really no idea how to navigate the Canadian labor market. You have all the information on the new immigrants who've just arrived. And we talk about how to improve the matchmaking between those seeking work and the employers that face these shortages.
Yeah.
But it just kind of feels like the federal government could do a lot more to create that pool of data, albeit protecting personal privacy and all those issues, just as you're proposing to do for these immigrants coming and trying to match them. Could we not create a better program where we as employers wouldn't just be taking a shot in the dark to, try to recruit randomly, but we would have access to that database that would really tell us who's got the skills.
Very good.
And where can we find them?
Very, very good questions, and yet the answer is yes. I applaud that as well. The answer is yes, and we are doing a better job. So we've invested significantly in radically improving the Canada Job Bank. I think I don't know what the latest number is, but we have tens of thousands of jobs currently posted on the Canada Job Bank. We began earlier this year sending out twice-a-day bulletins to people receiving employment insurance about jobs available in their local area. We've clarified the rules around employment insurance to remind people they have an obligation actively to seek and to accept available work at their skill level in their local communities. When employers now apply for labor market opinions to bring in temporary foreign workers, we're now requiring that they actually give us a plan indicating how they will increase the percentage of their workers who are Canadian citizens or residents, and we are indicating, like, for example, when an employer in Atlantic Canada applies for LMOs for a fish processing plant workers, we now say to them, hold on a second, we're not going to approve this because we know right now there are 75 people within 30-minute drive of your plant who are receiving EI who have worked in fish processing plants in the past. Why haven't you contacted these people first? So we're actually beginning, governments are always behind the curve on embracing technology, but we're beginning to embrace IT, the possibilities of information technology, to link employers with unemployed and underemployed Canadians. We could do much better in this, obviously, and we're actually exploring some interesting partnerships with companies like Monster and other commercial job banks because they've really refined the technology in this area. Finally, when it comes to immigrants or those who are already here, some of the immigrant settlement organizations are doing great work in their local communities to connect unemployed or underemployed immigrants with employers that are looking for available jobs. There are labor shortages in many of the Northern Ontario communities for specific skills, but a lot of unemployed and underemployed immigrants in the GTA. So there's actually a lot of collaboration happening, trying to find, well, who are these unemployed geologists and mining engineers and tradesmen who immigrated to Canada in the last decade, living in the GTA? How do we get them up north? So there is more of that happening. Still, too much of it is ad hoc, but I think your point is extremely well taken.
We have another question in the back, please. I think this will be the last.
Minister, thank you. The Canada Job Grant sounds very appealing. And it's easier to speak in a mic. My name is Mark Dietrich. I'm the CEO of the Ontario Society of Professional Engineers. You've expressed some willingness to be flexible in how the grant is implemented with provincial partners. We've had a lot of conversation recently about the role of the employer in making the system work better. Is there an opportunity, are you flexible enough potentially to think about an industry-based approach? I refer, for example, to what's going on right now in aerospace, some very exciting opportunities, lots of integration, lots of working together by lots of institutions to make training in aerospace engineering and aerospace services and technologies work better. So is there an opportunity to use this model in other industries and potentially lever the interest of certain employer groups?
I think so, yes, absolutely. One of the reasons that we began thinking about a policy tool like the job grant was precisely because we had the observation that here in Southern Ontario, you've experienced over 300,000, you've lost over 300,000 manufacturing jobs in the last decade. And yet we had employers like those in the aerospace industry or even in the auto parts manufacturing business like Linamar, come to us and say, we're desperate for people with specific skills. When I announced our new skilled trade stream for immigration, which is, by the way, allowing, for the first time since the early 1970s, people with practical skills to immigrate. When I announced that, the president of Linamar called me. He was thrilled. He said, finally, I can go to Germany and recruit some of these highly trained machinists to come to Canada. And I asked kind of an extension of the last question. Well, I said, how does this make any sense? We have 300,000 plus manufacturing workers who have lost their jobs in Southern Ontario in exactly the same communities where Linamar is operating. How come we can't get them trained up to be the machinists? And so this is where we thought there's clearly evidence of this kind of, we call it the skills gap. And I think that this can be very relevant to some of the high value added manufacturing kind of industries that you've identified, including aerospace.
Well, Minister, let me, on behalf of everybody, thank you so much. This is the Minister's third speech for the day, he tells me, and if it wasn't for the infrastructure in this region, you could probably have done 4. Those that know the Minister knows, as kind of the introducer said, he's probably the hardest working minister, but he's been at this issue of kind of the talent challenge in Canada for quite a period of time. I mean, our workforce in Canada grew at 1.5% for the last 30, 40 years. It's growing at half that today. And at the same time, the nature of work is changing. And both in your role as the Minister of Immigration and now, you've been going at that from all kind of the directions. I think it's a crucial issue for Canada. I think it's a crucial issue for the business community. And it's one, I think, Minister, that we would very much like to continue to work with you and other governments on. I was the deputy who was all involved in the signing of the Agreement on Interprovincial Trade in 1994, and I don't think there's been much trade since the agreement was signed, actually. So good luck on actually trying to kind of get those markets open for our people and for our goods and services and our wine, as somebody mentioned last night. Minister, thank you very much.
Thank you.